Today we are going to look into the second part of our series that we started regarding science and the Bible. And we're doing these sermons because the atheists have made a determined effort to prove that there is no God. And because God's existence cannot be proven scientifically, they believe that that gives them support for the fact that there is no God. Now, in reality, as we study the things that I'm going to present over the next few weeks, I think you're going to find more and more that the evolution side of atheism is just going to fall apart. And that in reality, instead of disproving the Bible, it seems like science is more and more showing that the Bible is accurate. And everything in it can be found archaeologically and scientifically to be true. Now last week, we looked at the first few verses of the Bible which talked about the time frame of God. Exactly how long did it take God to create this universe and this world and everything in it? And one of the things that came out of it was that even though the atheists are of the opinion that there is no God, well, one of their big arguments is, how could God create everything in just 6 days? And they're basing those 6 days on a 24-hour period. And so last week we looked at the fact that in reality, for the first 4 days that God came and worked, there was no sun, there was no moon, there were none of the things that we would normally use to measure time. And so God, well, he works outside of time anyway. Psalms chapter 90, verse 4. 1,000 years in your sight are like a day that has just gone by, or like a watch in the night. 2 Peter chapter 3, verse 8 says, but do not forget this one thing, dear friends. With the Lord, a day is like 1,000 years, and 1,000 years are like a day. So that tells us quite quickly that God does not measure time. He has no, I guess you could say, real limitations to it, because whether he does things super fast at hypersonic speeds, or whether he does things really, really slow over a long period of time, doesn't make any difference. God works until something is perfect, and then he moves on. So when it speaks about God did this on the first day, well, the scriptures are actually saying there was chaos, and God put it into order. And of course, at the end of every day, God would look at it and say, it is good. And that would be the end of the first day, which more accurately would be that was the end of the first age. That was the end of the first period of God's creation. And there are 4 of these during which there is no way to measure time. So whether it was 24 hours, 24 years, 2,400 years, 24 million years, I have no idea, and the scriptures don't go into that at all. But hopefully through this series of sermons, and speaking scientifically, there is far more evidence that there is a God than that there is not. And as a result, it's the fool who cannot look around him and see the intelligent design everywhere. And that's what the scriptures tell us. The fool says in his heart, there is no God. People who are smart, people who are willing to open their minds and their eyes and see the things, they're going to come to the conclusion that somebody made this. Somebody really smart made this, because there is intelligent designs in everything. So in our studies, we are going to try and stick just with pure science. In other words, things that can be measured, things that have been recorded, things that we can look at and perhaps repeat, so that we are following a proper scientific principle in everything we want to look at and discuss. So, one of the things about science, it must rely upon different things. For instance, biology, chemistry, archaeology, physics, and especially mathematics. These things are all known, provable sciences. And when you do an experiment to find out whether something is true or not, you must be able to repeat it accurately every single time, or we can't rely upon it. So, they have a problem. They have a problem in that this world is so beautiful, so intricate, so incredible in the way it works, that they cannot recognize that somebody created this. But that is a problem for most people. You see, they make a mistake in that they try and compare God to human beings. Now, the ancient people, the Romans and the Greeks, they very definitely modeled their gods upon people. And as a result, their gods had a lot of shortcomings, their gods had a lot of frailties, their gods had a lot of arrogance and anger, and yeah, they were kind of hard to deal with because they were not actually gods. They were just mythological creations based upon what humans thought gods would be like. Now you have to remember something, that all of the things they attributed to these gods, they did as ancient people with a very limited amount of scientific knowledge. I mean, we're talking about really almost nothing scientific at all. They were just dabbling a little bit in medicine and anatomy and things like that. So they were only just beginning to scratch the surface of the scientific world. But you have to remember, at the time, it was taught as true that the earth was flat, and that if you sailed too far out into the ocean, you would fall off the edge. They didn't know the truth. Their science was faulty. The things that they knew, actually, they did not know. They had made it up, and it had been accepted for years and years as traditional, but it was wrong. So we're going to try and avoid the mistakes that a lot of people have made, assuming that what they knew prior to this was correct and accurate. Because a lot of times, it was not. So today, we are going to go down to the very smallest foundational building block of everything. Everything we see, everything we feel, everything we touch and taste and smell, everything is founded upon little things called atoms. And I want to show you a tiny little video clip. It's a little bit scientific, and you may not follow it. It may not make a lot of sense, but I want you just to see something to understand what science says is at the foundational level of all matter in the universe.
Atomic structure. In this video, we're going to go over atomic structure in a very simplistic and basic way. Atoms are the basic unit of chemical elements. They contain subatomic particles in their nucleus and in the electron cloud that surrounds the nucleus. These subatomic particles include protons and neutrons, which are located in the nucleus, and electrons, which are located in the cloud or field that surrounds the nucleus. Protons have a positive electrical charge, neutrons are uncharged, and electrons have a negative charge. The number of protons and electrons are equal, so atoms are electrically neutral particles. If we look at a model of the element carbon, which has 6 protons, 6 electrons, and in most cases 6 neutrons, we can see the electrons in simple rings or shells surrounding the nucleus. Each shell represents a different energy level, and it can only hold a certain maximum number of electrons. In chemical reactions between atoms, only the electrons in the outermost shell participate in the resulting chemical bond. In atoms with only one energy level or shell, 2 electrons are required for stability. If we look at helium, which has only one shell or energy level, we see that it is full because it contains 2 electrons. So helium is stable, and there is no naturally occurring compound containing helium. Hydrogen, which also has only one ring or shell, possesses only 1 electron in its shell, so it's chemically reactive. In atoms with more than one energy level or shell, 8 electrons are required in its outermost shell for stability. So neon, which has 8 electrons in its outermost shell, is stable. And oxygen, which has only 6 electrons in its outermost shell, is chemically reactive. Atoms that do have fewer than 8 electrons in their outermost shells will try to share, gain, or lose electrons in order to become stable. This is called the octet rule. But there are some exceptions, such as we saw with hydrogen and helium, which have only one energy level or shell. And that be the basics on atomic structure.
Okay, now basically what you saw there were some rings with little circles and little balls in them, and the main thing about it is it tries to express the part that this atom is really, really small. Now, you don't get that, but in reality the most powerful microscope in the world has apparently finally captured an image of an atom. Now, I'm going to show you what that picture looks like. This is supposed to be a nitrogen atom. Okay, it doesn't look like anything I saw in that little video clip, does it? It's kind of a blurry little blob on a two-dimensional surface that, okay. How is that an atom anything like what the scientists are describing, though? Where are the little electron shells and things they're talking about? And I don't get it. I'm looking at it, and it doesn't look anything like an atom like I'm expecting. You know, when we grow up and we go to high school and things, we often get told about these atoms and what they look like. And usually they're represented in certain ways. Now, the one over on my left-hand side is a more three-dimensional representation of the atom. And the other one is a two-dimensional representation, so you can actually see the atoms in the actual shells, as they call them. But it was not until 2017 that scientists were able to create that little blurry image that we just looked at. Yeah, it's only 5 years ago that this was even possible, and that they have something there, and they believe it's a nitrogen atom, and so they have labeled it such. But I don't see it. I don't see the protons, I don't see the neutrons, I don't see the electrons. I just see some blurry blobs that kind of are bigger than others, and they've colored them different colors. But I would never know that that's a nitrogen atom from the description of what I'm supposed to be able to see or hear or understand. So in a way, I have a hard time accepting that. Hebrews chapter 11, verses 1 to 3. Now faith is confidence in what we hope for, and assurance about what we do not see. That is what the ancients were commended for. By faith we understand that the universe was formed at God's command, so that what is seen was not made out of what is visible. Oh, in other words, the stuff that we see now is made out of stuff we cannot see. Stuff that, for all intents and purposes, is invisible. And yeah, until recently, well, that's the first image we've had that is supposed to be a nitrogen atom. But I don't know if I'm going for it. But maybe when you were looking at this and listening to the little video clip, if you're like me, you would have immediately had a little alarm bell going off saying, wait a minute, something's wrong here. Because they're showing the nucleus full of these little things called protons and neutrons. And the protons are positively charged. They're all like charged. And the electrons are negatively charged. So we don't have a problem with the protons pulling the electrons in and holding them in an orbit. That works fine. Opposites attract. But like particles repel each other. Now, any of you who've ever played around with magnets, you know this. Yeah, When you take a horseshoe magnet or something like that, you take the North Pole and the South Pole and you put them together, boom, man, they lock together. The North and the South, they attract each other very strongly. But flip the magnet over, one of them, and try to push the North together with the other North and the South together with the other South. Well, any of you who've done that realize that, man, they don't like each other. They refuse to go together, and the closer you get them to each other, the harder they push apart. Yeah, you have to use a lot of force to force them to even touch each other. And of course, if you removed your fingers, what's going to happen? Well, maybe not what you think. I would have thought, oh, it's going to fly off, but no, what it actually does is it jumps up a little bit and then it immediately flips around and drops back down. In other words, the poles reverse themselves and they attract and they bang, snap together. Oh, so like poles do not like each other. Opposites attract. We've had that saying for many, many, many years. So, magnets are like the particles in the center of that nucleus. So then the question comes up, well, if they're trying to repel each other, what holds them together? Well, it's not the neutrons, because the neutrons have no charge at all. They're just there. Why they're even there, we don't know. But they don't seem to have any effect on the nucleus of the atom. So, scientists have been stumped for a really long time. Ever since they've recognized what the atomic structure is supposed to be like, the nucleus creates this puzzle that does not make sense. Now, most of you have heard about Albert Einstein. Okay. Now, Albert Einstein was a very smart man in that he saw things and recognized things. And as he studied matter and the structure of matter, he saw this problem. Yeah, he saw that the nucleus shouldn't even exist, and yet it's absolutely stable. What on earth keeps these protons stuck together? What holds them into place so that there even is a nucleus? And he looked at that and puzzled with that. And scientifically, he could not come up with an answer. Now, as he dug around, he came up with some interesting conclusions. First of all, he believed in God. He was a Jewish man, and he believed in God. Whether he believed in God the way I believe in God is probably debatable. But he did believe that somebody had created this universe, and he did believe that matter itself was somehow created by God, and that's where his little interesting, I guess you could say, scientific penchant kind of went. He looked at the nucleus. Why on earth is that thing stuck together? How on earth are those things held together? And you know, he finally came to a conclusion. And his conclusion was, it must be God. There must be some law at work here that we are unaware of that God put into place. And that God's law holds that nucleus together. Now that kind of brought up a little idea in his head. Well, if something is holding it together, it must have a form of energy. You know, heat, light, gravity. These were thought to be forms of energy. And he had this idea that there must be some form of energy holding that nucleus together. And that's God's power is holding that together. And he got this crazy idea. What if I could shove a screwdriver in there and wedge it apart just a little bit? Would it still pull together, or would it fly apart like it wants to do? Well, he got to thinking, and he drew up this huge mathematical formula that led to the atomic bomb. Yeah, Einstein managed to find a way to split the atom, and boy, the results were unbelievable. And I mean that. When the scientists finally did this, they were all shocked at how much energy was released. And we're talking about from a lump of uranium that was only about the size of a softball. It wasn't that big. and yet it released the energy like the sun. Horrible results came about, destruction, and then of course the radioactivity that came about was a scary thing to have to deal with. But we have peaceful uses for atomic energy. We have kind of tamed it and controlled it in little nuclear reactions, and it goes and goes and goes and goes and goes, but it's limited and it's controlled, and we use it to heat up water into steam, and the steam turns turbines that generate electricity. And we've got quite a lot of nuclear power plants scattered around the United States and other places in the world. But we have people out there who are afraid of the nuclear energy and also the byproducts that are left over from this kind of reaction. They stay radioactive for like the next 50,000 years. What are you going to do with it? Where are you going to store it? How are you going to store it? Is it going to be safe, or are we all going to die from radiation poisoning if it leaks out and gets into our water supply system or something else similar? So there have been a lot of fears about the peaceful use of nuclear power. But Einstein's theory, and it's actually a whole book, it's not just this one little simple equation. The whole book of equations eventually comes down to this one conclusion, and that is the energy equals the mass of the atom times the speed of light squared. Now the speed of light is 186,000 miles per second. 186,000 miles per second. Whew. That's fast, but to give you an idea of how fast it is, the sun's 93 million miles away. It takes 8 minutes for the light from the sun to reach us here on Earth. Okay, it takes a little while, but that's still really fast. But if you take that speed, 186,000 miles, and times it times itself, you'll end up with this big, huge number about this big, and you won't even know what it is. Is it billions? Is it trillions? Is it quadrillions? Is it, I don't even know what it is. But yeah, it's a really big number, and you multiply that number times the tiny little bit of mass that a single atom has. And you end up with a huge amount of energy that is there holding it together. And if you can pop it apart and the energy is released, it is a phenomenally high amount of energy. So Einstein, he saw this. He started teaching this. Of course, a lot of people were skeptical that it was that much energy, but hey, his formula has worked over and over again for over 50 years. People are arguing with it, saying, well, there are a few errors in it, but still the bottom line does come down to the fact that there is an amazing amount of energy holding every single atom together, all of it. And that's kind of important. Yeah. Because when you work out that that first bomb that was dropped on Hiroshima, it killed almost 140,000 people. Yeah, on August the 6th, 1945. And the two bombs were dropped on Nagasaki and Hiroshima, brought World War II pretty much to an end, at least in the Pacific. That was the end of that. The Japanese surrendered almost immediately. And it wasn't too long after that that Germany finally also surrendered. But most scientists are still desperately searching for an answer to this predicament. That does not include God. See, that's the problem. They're not upset with the formula, even though they don't feel it's totally accurate. And nowadays, we're not sure that the speed of light is actually the absolute limit to speed. And maybe able to go faster than the speed of light, or maybe things that go faster than the speed of light. But at the moment, we're still sticking with it. Fact is, this theoretical particle system falls apart because of just one simple little thing, and that is, like particles repel each other. How do you get away from that? Okay, God put energy into a law that holds all matter together. You know, when scientists can't explain something, they usually come up with a name. Yeah, it's weird. You see, Einstein realized that the more he studied science, the more he believed in God, because the intelligence of the design and the power and the energy that were there at work, he couldn't ignore them. He couldn't just brush it off and give it a kind of a name and call it something and let it go at that. But that's what scientists do nowadays. They create all kinds of particle names. Oh yeah. They got muons and leptons, and they got quarks, and they got up quarks and down quarks, and of course electrons and neutrons and protons. But they're coming up with all kinds of names of these things, and the latest one is a gluon. Yeah, they think that's what sticks it together. It's called a gluon. Very imaginative. But the fact is, all of these things, purely theoretical. We actually have no scientific proof that these things exist. In other words, we've never been able to create experiments over and over and over again that repeat and give us exactly the same result. Sometimes we get the same result, and sometimes we don't get the same result. So guess what? That's not scientific. Just because you get a result once in a while does not make it science. Remember what science means? It means we know this is true. We know this is accurate. It's knowledge. No. They have a bunch of fictional, mythological creations that they have thrown in to try and explain everything that exists without using God. They do not give God any credit for this creation. They do not want to. They cannot. Romans chapter 1, starting at verse 18. The wrath of God is being revealed from heaven against all the godlessness and wickedness of people who suppress the truth by their wickedness. Since what may be known about God is plain to them, because God has made it plain to them. For since the creation of the world, God's invisible qualities, his eternal power, and his divine nature, have been clearly seen, being understood from what has been made, so that those people are without excuse. I love that. They have no excuse. They cannot ignore it. It's real. It's there. And if they would accept it, they would find out that the science then makes sense when you incorporate God and his power. It makes sense. It all falls together. Scientific experiments now will start to repeat themselves perfectly if you consider God in the equation. But of course, that's not going to happen anytime soon. The absolute basis for everything that exists in this physical world relies upon what is actually a scientific impossibility. The stability of the atom, everything around you, everything you touch, the seats you're sitting on, they're made out of atoms that should not exist scientifically. They break rules. There are laws, other laws that are being broken by that thing holding itself together somehow. And they try and explain it without God's power. Now think about this. That's being held together because God told it to happen. God brought these things into existence by the power of his word. Yeah. They exist because God gave them rules, regulations, laws to obey. And they do. Matter obeys the laws of nature beautifully. Because they aren't the laws of nature, they're the laws of God. And yes, they don't dare disobey. But think about this. When God is finished with this universe, when the purpose of this earth is over, and you know, the scriptures tell us it's going to be done, it's going to be finished, it's going to be destroyed. So completely that you will never know it even existed. You know what? That's not as hard as you would think. Let's just suppose that God finally one day tells the atoms, okay guys, I know I've been telling you to stick together even though it's against your nature. Just do your thing. Just do what comes naturally. Forget the laws that I gave you. Could you suddenly imagine every atom in the universe suddenly flying apart? Because that is their nature. Can you imagine what would happen if all of those particles erupted with the amount of energy that Einstein said is there in the middle of that nucleus? The energy equals the mass times the speed of light squared. Can you imagine the Big Bang that would take place? And you know, that's what it says in the scriptures. It tells us that the earth will disappear with a shrill noise. And it'll disappear with fire. Well, you know, that's what the atomic bomb basically was. It was a really shrill noise, and it was a huge fireball. Because here's the weird thing. The atoms that created that were not even destroyed. They were only split one time. Each of those atoms in the uranium nucleus were split. And they became other things like plutonium. Oh, another atom? Yeah. But the bigger atom was split. And just that separation created a huge amount of energy. Imagine if the whole atom had been destroyed. Whoa, wait a minute. We're talking about hundreds of little explosions that didn't happen, equal to the one that did. Man, that is mind-blowing. The explosion of an atom bomb, just one atom bomb with like 40 or 50 pounds of uranium in it, destroys a whole city. Whew. Imagine every atom in the universe suddenly self-destructing. And that's all it would take. God's word. Hey, we're done here. We don't need you anymore. And there would be a shrill noise and a big bang. 2 Peter chapter 3, verse 10. But the day of the Lord will come like a thief. And on that day the heavens will disappear with a shrill noise, and the heavenly bodies will burn up and be destroyed, and the earth and everything in it will vanish. That's God's wrath, and that's coming. And it doesn't take much for God to do it. He just has to upset the laws that he himself created. He just has to tell those laws to stop working. You know, God has been patient with the people of this world. Yeah. We forget how patient God is. This world is becoming so disgusting, so sinful, so weak, so perverse in the things it does. Try to imagine how God feels about this wickedness. Try to imagine the amount of wrath that he is having towards the people of this earth. And not just because they're ignoring him, but because they're ignoring every moral thing that God has ever tried to tell people to follow. How to behave, how to get on with each other. They've ignored all of it. And they're acting like crazy, insane, rabid animals. God has had it. One day, he will put an end to it. But until then, God did something that some people find offensive. You might find this offensive. God took his own dear son, had him beaten and whipped and tortured, and then nailed to a cross to die. Why? He actually did it for you and for me. He actually did it in order to bring us back into his fellowship. He actually did it in order to bring about forgiveness of our sins. Because Jesus died for no sin of his own. He died for the sins of the world. And on that cross, he is able to bring forgiveness to anyone who will put their hope and their faith and their trust in him and yield to his will and become obedient servants to him.